everyone, and welcome to the Alt Funds Network podcast. I am Judith Peterson. I'll be guest moderating today. Today's conversation is about the SEC rules on cybersecurity that are due to drop in April. We have an esteemed panel of industry minds who are going to dissect this topic from various perspectives. We have John Araneo, who is a partner with Cole-Frieman and Mallon. He is the lead of their cybersecurity practice. We have Daniel Strachman, managing partner of ANC Advisors, which provides fund directors and governance to funds. And also Kumar Ujjwal, who is CEO and founder of DwellFi, an AI tech company who's helping private funds get productivity and scale. So, John, I'll have you kick us off. Welcome, gentlemen. I'll have you kick us off, John, and give us kind of unpack the rule and give us a nice overview.
Great. Thank you, Judith. Yeah, so we're at an interesting time in cybersecurity in the asset management space. The SEC has a new cybersecurity risk management rule that portends an entirely new cybersecurity compliance regime, which is being formed right in front of our eyes. So this rule, just for housekeeping purposes and so we can communicate effectively about this rule, it was proposed in 2022 by the SEC, and we're expecting its approval to be in April of 2024 with an enforcement date soon thereafter. It's important to distinguish this rule, which applies to registered investment advisors and registered companies, from the public company cybersecurity risk management rule, which was passed by the SEC last year in July. So today we're talking about the rule about to be passed that applies to the asset management community. So when the rule passes, there'll be some material changes. We're going to focus on that today because they're important and they're different. There is a current regime for registered investment advisors as it relates to cybersecurity. In 2014, the SEC sort of started this dialogue around cybersecurity, and through a series of numerous expressions in the form of risk alerts, guidance updates, and other materials, and SEC enforcement actions, it created sort of an ask, if you will, a list of requirements that composed a model cybersecurity program for any given asset manager. This was sort of a combination of 7 different controls, categorical controls, that were technological and non-technological. Suffice it to say that right now and up until the rule passes, the regulatory ask on cybersecurity from the SEC has really been boiled down into just these annual cybersecurity assessments and to have written cybersecurity policies and procedures. That's the backdrop from which we'd like to distinguish what's going on with the rule today, because there are some major changes. Essentially, when this rule passes, and we're expecting it, as I said, in this spring, it will double down on the requirement of having policies and procedures and these annual assessments, but it brings in 3 new wholesale categorical requirements, which has been unprecedented in terms of asset management and cybersecurity. So what we'll do is we'll break down the rule. I'll do it quite quickly into 4 different parts. So if you will, we're trying to provide a cheat sheet on the new rule broken into 4 pieces. So part 1 is really similar to the current regime in that the bulk of this is to have policies and procedures that are reasonably designed to create a certain level of cybersecurity baseline and maturity. These are written policies that need to be mapped to actual operational, technological, and governance security controls, and they should be commensurate with each firm, which is good in theory but hard in practice. Suffice it to say that an asset manager with less than, let's say, 100 million AUM need not have the same level of controls as an asset manager with much more resources and sophistication. In addition to these policies and procedures, there needs to be these annual cybersecurity assessments. This is really a gap analysis, and you need to do this with a third-party advisor that is able to evaluate the basics of your information network and your operational processes to make sure that there are certain fundamental cybersecurity controls in place. These things range from employee training, to incident response plans from the non-technological stance, and also to things like encryption and MFA and mobile device management on the technological plane. What the new rule will require, and this is different, is in addition to doing these annual assessments and having these policies, that registered investment advisors will now need to produce annual written reports. This is a separate document that basically attests that they have read the assessment for that year, they understand its content, and they understand what they've charted out for the next year's assessment and the following year's annual written report. This is important because it requires a heightened level of engagement and continuity from investment advisors than the current regime. In addition to this, what these policies and procedures, I think it's beyond us to go into detail on this podcast, but encompasses things like user security and access, information protection, threat and vulnerability management, and incident response. So in a nutshell, that's the first piece. The three pieces, as I mentioned before, are entirely new. And I think talking to asset managers for the last 5 or 6 years about cybersecurity, I think by and large, the industry as a whole is not yet prepared for these next three pieces. The first is a reporting requirement. What this means is that there will now be a requirement for asset managers to report in writing, confidentially, to the SEC if they experience what the SEC is labeling as a significant cybersecurity incident. That definition will have specific criteria. It's broken down essentially high level if there's any sort of operational breakdown at the firm, or if investor or third party or critical data is put in jeopardy. Those two things would rise to the level of this being a significant cybersecurity incident that would need to be reported. The SEC is amending Form ADV, the form to register as an investment advisor, with a Form ADV-C, and that will be the form that you can put these these breach reports in place with the SEC and file with them confidentially. The third piece, which is similar but subtly distinguished from this reporting requirement, is a disclosure requirement. This requires investment advisors to disclose not to the SEC but to the investors, to their investors, what their cybersecurity posture is generally, and perhaps how that's been affected by recent cybersecurity incidents. That could mean a breach, but it could also mean a revamping of their operational or information technology network. But to disclose this is something new. The fourth and final piece that the new rule will bring is a record-keeping requirement that will be for 5 years and is designed to capture all of the documents, all of the inquiries, whether it's regulatory inquiries or cybersecurity assessments, reporting, vulnerability scans, penetration tests, manuals, policies, everything that's encompassed by the rule. You need to maintain these records for a period of 5 years. So in a nutshell, this is a very big ask. They're kind of doubling down on cyber. And a lot of the industry that has conformed to sort of the best practices of cyber to date, I think is vastly unprepared for pivoting and meeting all these different requirements.
Thank you very much, John. Look, this rule is going to require managers to engage in a data discovery exercise so that they can understand their total data universe and be able to locate and classify their data in accordance with an appropriate data governance methodology. So for many fund managers with various third-party providers, their data network is comprised of disparate and dislocated data pools across unrelated third parties. So Kumar, I'll pivot to you to say, how are funds going to get data ready? And I guess the second part of that is, because you're an expert in AI, I know you have 2 patents. How can AI help funds ID, harmonize, map, and classify their data, their current data, and then have a process for any new data that's created?
Thank you for asking the question, having me. So this is actually a very big ask, as we've been talking about, because most of the industry is not yet ready from cybersecurity or from the data perspective. Because if you look at the lay of the land, how it is, it's the way it's mostly structured is there are a bunch of tools, and generally the practice is people use different tools for different things and stitch together to make their own workflow, and that's how it's been working so far. So now if you put a data security layer on top of that, it's it's you will figure it out that there's opportunity of vulnerability at every scale, and that creates a huge issue. And then on top of that, now you have to have a reporting. So for every single tool, you have to have a different reporting. So end of the day, it needs to be a holistic view, how you can bring all your data at one place. Then once the data is at one place, you also have to think about how to apply your data governance on top of this, but which is not just on the uh, verticalized, but horizontally. So it comes from the top to bottom approach as an industry, which is more like I would say, defragmented right now. You have to bring it all together. So to do all those things, there's two parts of that. One is, of course, the IT. The Every organization has their IT in-house or outsourced. That is one of the key player. But also from the strategic point of view from the company, because this is not just one thing that you fix it and one time it's done. It's going to be a continuous process. So once this data securities or cybersecurities uh, things which you're going to apply in your company is going to keep doing it until the law is there. I think it'll be forever and it's good for everyone. So from that perspective, it's a strategic decision how to do this and where to start from. And this is one of the big problems where to start, because today the problem is like the data is everywhere. It's on multiple silos. To do the data discovery and where to start, that is itself is a big problem. So that's where the AI capabilities comes into the picture. And now, given the advancement of the AI, the way has gone, now there's a lot of things that's possible and can be done in a much more productive way than was supposed to be done earlier. So that's where the use of AI will come. So the first thing will be the data discovery, how to find the data where it is, doing the data labeling, and categorization, which was heavily human-based task, and it could have taken like forever to do those things in a big organization. Now it can be done much effectively and much faster way. Then once that is done, then application applying the governance, and then at the same time in real time monitoring those data governance is possible through the AI features, and then finally having a overall view of your entire company dashboard, I would say, how the data and the security and monitoring is possible. And all these things can be possible in a much more efficient way through AI than was done previously.
Thanks for that. I appreciate the distinction that this is not a destination but a journey, and it's not going away. To that, I'm gonna ask you, Dan. The managers that you're working with how are they prepared for this, and what are you seeing in the marketplace?
So before we get to that, now I'm happy to answer that. Thanks. That's a nice question for me. So John, I had two questions for you. The first is you said that there's going to be a Form ADV Part C now, or Form C, which will have breach reports that will not be available to the public. Is that what the SEC is saying?
Yeah, it's a Form ADVC that will
Right.
be passed along with the rule, and that's the form that is filed with the SEC right now. They're requiring 48 hours, but yes.
Interesting, and they're agreeing to not let that be out there, so no one can see it.
Yes.
Okay, so talk about the SEC pushing for transparency. That's excellent work on their part. Second of all, I thought I have to take umbrage with one thing you said, and this gets to the heart of what Judith had just asked me about. I think you said a fund with under 100 million. And if I'm misquoting you, please don't tell me, because I'm going to stick with what I'm saying. Come on, that was funny, man. You got to laugh a little bit. Anyway, 100 million in and AUM shouldn't have the same policies, procedures, etc., as someone north of that. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it. But as we all know, and we all have some long-term experience in this industry, that most managers act as if, right? The guy or the girl with 5 million AUM thinks they're going to be BlackRock one day, or thinks they're going to be Blackstone one day, or Fidelity, or Maverick, or whomever, or Mariner, or whomever. And so they're going to act as a. So I would tell you that I would expect that funds of all sizes, not just those north of 100 million AUM, are going to need to do this kind of work. And not to make, I know you guys your firm is so well entrenched and so deals with such big managers, but we happen to deal with a lot of small managers as well as some good sized firms, and we're seeing them, Judith, to answer your question, we're seeing them, most of them don't even know this is coming, right? They're not paying attention to it.
Yeah.
They're I don't want to say they're asleep at the switch, but they're sort of asleep at the switch. I mean, we're letting them know that they have to be thinking about it, but from a governance perspective, when we talk to funds or we sit on boards of funds, that's what we're talking to them about. But most of them don't understand this. And the other thing here is, I think this is another question that I'd ask you is, why do we need this now? What is the purpose for this?
Yeah.
Does the SEC really think that fund managers aren't paying attention to cybersecurity, that they're not paying attention to, data breaches, and maybe they are. Maybe managers aren't paying attention to, managing data lakes properly. But I do think, in general, none of the managers that we are engaged with, they're operating under the assumption that when they're going to get hacked, not if they're going to get hacked, right? And so they're all thinking that.
Yeah. So really good point.
Yeah, I'm just curious what you think on that.
Really good point, Dan. I'll go to your first question too about the clarification. So what I was saying is that there is a requirement. There has to be policies and procedures in place that the SEC has said, like many of the prevailing global cybersecurity frameworks outside of the SEC. This idea of appropriateness on a sliding scale, commensurate. So the point I was trying to make is that everybody needs to. The ask is that you have policies in place.
Right.
But the scope and the sophistication and the extent of these, when I say policies and procedures, it's not only the written policies, but the controls that are in place. Do we have to have an incident response plan, and do we have to test it every year? If we're 150 employees, we should probably test it every year. If we're 3 employees, maybe we don't. So that was the point there, and I'm glad that you asked about it to clarify that. It's the sliding scale of being commensurate. I think to your second question, which is, do we need this? So it's also an interesting question. I'll try to give a brief and succinct answer. I think that basically every other industry, and the states are encroaching on this, is that it's becoming negligent not to have any cybersecurity controls in place.
Sure.
I do think that most people are aware that the world is truly in a perpetual state of breach. I don't think the investment management industry has grasped the idea fully, in that if I have an incident, most people immediately assume they're negligent. That's not the case. What I think is what happens in practice is most people assume that their IT firm has controls in place for the IT firm, and therefore, because they chose that vendor to manage its information system, that it can rely on the piggyback of that. That's not what cybersecurity is. Cybersecurity is sort of a dance. It's a multifactorial issue that requires a multidisciplinary response. So you need to sort of pick and choose and marry policies and procedures to different controls. So I do think many of the other industries and other regimes, including the rest of the world, is pushing for basic cybersecurity controls. And that I do think there is a learning curve, and I absolutely do think it's necessary. That might be a discussion for another podcast, but I just wanted to address that square on.
Right.
And then
Well,
I just want.
That's fair. Sorry.
No, Dan, go ahead.
I just wanted to tell what Dan you were saying, that given the small funds and they're not thinking about, and then they think like when they can be hacked. It's actually, we have seen the practical example, like the way this industry works, and people store data. Like, to give you an example, like data is stored in Excel sheet, and social security numbers, people's accreditation sits into some basic file drives, and to get those things hacked is very easy. It's not that if it's in a Gmail account that you need to break Gmail, but you can do social engineering and hack those things and get access to all those things. And that is where the problem is. So keeping those data encrypted, some basic standard where you need some kind of encryption to store certain type of data is important, and I think that's where the SEC is going.
So I guess Kumar, and then I'll get to you, John. So when you think about kind of an action plan for cyber readiness relative to data, what would you add to that? Because I think you just kind of outlined it a bit, but could you go into a little bit more detail?
Yeah, I was just trying to explain like that. There should be always some basic standard of data encryption and the way the data is stored, because when hack and vulnerability happens, it happens on the multiple stages, and it's not just that you have to break some existing system like Google or Microsoft. So people think like, okay, I've stored it in a file drive, and that is safe. Yes, it's safe from a one standard that okay, unless your password is not known, correct? But social engineering can help. So that's how most of the hackers try to secure your password and then gets into your account, not like breaking Microsoft or Gmail encryption. So to get to that level, once they have access to everything. So that is where so to get to that next step is cybersecurity and data ready for that is applying proper data governance in your data infrastructure is the most important thing. And what I mean by that is once you store the data, you have a certain standard of encryption that its data is stored in rest and in motion, both. When it's stored, it's encrypted. And second, who has access to what type of data. So if an account is breached, still the people don't have access to everything, but they have only access to a certain uh, amount of data. So you can easily tackle that and handle that thing. So it's not like every single hack is not the entire your company wide. And that's what's been happening so far. So if you look at the bigger hacks, which has happened for Equifax and all, one single account can hack the entire Social Security of $40 million, 40 million accounts. So those are the things which we need to start thinking about in the industry, how to implement, get your data ready or get your infrastructure ready for this cybersecurity.
I guess kind of following on that, John, did you want to give us a bit of a roadmap to cyber readiness? Because I think Kumar kind of laid out one component, which sounds like it's foundational to some of what you had talked about earlier.
Yeah, I think the importance of data governance and a data mapping exercise, as Kumar just articulated, can't be understated. That's extremely important. It is somewhat theoretical and requires a plan to approach. I think the new rule does luckily provide an avenue to create a very practical and methodical plan of action, which is one of the good things of this new rule. So for an asset manager that is subject to the rule and wants to comply with it, it's very clear. You're supposed to be, and you will be required to be doing these annual assessments every year. You need to start with that. If you haven't done one, you need to do one that will provide you with a baseline of your cybersecurity posture. Once you do that and you identify the things you're doing well, the controls that you do have in place, and the ones that you do not, you work with a cybersecurity advisor, usually the one that does that gap analysis, that assessment, and put together a roadmap. You might find, similar to if you do a home inspection before you buy a home, you might find 20 things that are checked. And then when you realize going through the list, you triage and you prioritize them, and then you come up with a roadmap. Once you have a roadmap, you sort of prioritize the things that you want to achieve. Again, as you said, Judith, this is a journey. So for the next year, we don't have to tackle all 20 or all 10. We'll pair that with a reasonable budget that we're prepared to commit to this. And then that's really the 3 steps. So it's to do an assessment, work with an advisor and build a roadmap, come with a budget, and then just knock them out one by one to the next assessment period. That's pretty much a straight linear path to complying with the rule.
Sounds great. And Dan, from your perspective, what action items do you see for service providers?
So well, for service providers, I think the answer is they have to be paying attention to this rule and they have to understand what their role is to providing this side of these sort of services, tools, technology, what have you, to not only their customers, but the end user, right? The investor. I think from a manager perspective, it's something that, they have to be paying attention to, as John has pointed out, regardless of size. They have to be thinking about how they're going to implement these sort of new rules and regulations to make their data safer and to be more sort of engaged on an area that most likely they haven't been engaged in going forward. But also, I think during the due diligence process, this is something that they're going to be asked about. What is your cyber policy? How has it been going? Have you had to file any breaches with the SEC? People are going to be asking about this, because just like people are starting to pay attention to independent directors, they're starting to pay attention to third-party administrators, they're starting to pay attention to audit and tax firms. I think this is similar. They're going to start paying attention to what rules are being put in place and how managers acting upon them. And this, John, I don't know if this is your area of expertise, although I'm sure you are an expert in it, which is the new rules are coming out regarding most favored nations, regarding investors, right? And the fact that, all investors need to be treated equally, right? I mean,
Yep.
which I don't think anyone has a problem with, but still it's something that, although I sort of said I had a problem with it, but that's a whole other issue. That's another issue. People are talking about that from an investor standpoint. This is another example of the SEC implementing something that's going to cause investors to talk about it. So I think if a manager is smart, Judith, to answer your question, they're going to engage with their service providers to make sure that they're able to, sort of meet at least, and maybe even exceed the expectations of their investors and potential investors when it comes to showing and demonstrating that they're operating correctly under these new regulations.
Thank you, Dan. John, did you want to add anything from your perspective around what funds should expect from their providers? I think Dan laid it out nicely, but do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So I've been doing these cybersecurity assessments and writing policies. I've done it for over 700 managers in the past 7 years. And I've had to, in doing that, you have to corral sort of all the necessary service providers that a typical investment management firm relies on. So the obligations or the input from each vendor has sort of evolved. Initially, there was a misperception that my IT firm will handle it. As most of the industry has learned or will soon learn, is that an investment advisor has a regulatory obligation as a fiduciary to create its own policy, and it can use the technology and the controls that are provided by a vendor, but it has to curate from them and do a more bespoke process and build certain controls that are technological and non-technological in nature from that. So I think the role of the IT firm is probably the most often one that's subject to a misperception. The IT firm should not be assessing their own IT infrastructure. It's not, there's a potential, or an apparent, I shouldn't say there's an apparent conflict, and it's just more objective in every cybersecurity framework that there's a third party with an arm's length transaction to view the infrastructure and see if the controls are up to speed. I think as much as the IT vendor should not be in control of the assessment and identifying the gaps, they're inextricably intertwined in the process, because you're paying them for technology, and there needs to be technological tweaks and contours to nip and tuck the environment that you're using to meet certain controls. But that should not come from the MSP. So your IT firm or your MSP should be an ally in this, but they should not be the general leading the charge. Similarly, compliance firms, unfortunately, because the way the SEC has sort of kick this can down the road, it's kind of fell in the laps of compliance advisors. The typical compliance consultant is an expert in the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. They don't really have any technological or security training by default, by the nature of what they do. So they are, most of the policies and procedures that the compliance firms have sort of generated in the beginning of this was just a regurgitation of what the SEC had been saying. That's not what the SEC expects, doesn't want you to restate what the rule says and says we will have a policy to train our employees about cyber. The policy needs to read how you're training them, how frequently, and what the reporting is. So I think where the service providers that can really help, 2 points I want to make, and I'll try to do it quickly. One is, unlike a general enterprise, a Fortune 100 company that has thousands of employees and has committees and has resources of internal employees that can do different functions and can draw on them at any time. Many investment managers rely on third parties, some on the less sophisticated end, whether it's outsourced chief compliance officer or outsourced chief financial officer. But typically, a lot of the fundamental business units that are often internal to an enterprise operation are external and outsourced. So that means that just by nature of this, the at the beginning of this journey, you have to go outside your organization and tap on the shoulders of certain service providers who you're paying to do a different service to engage in a dialogue with three other service providers, and that's very difficult because typically these functions are dislocated from one another. So that's sort of one of the problems or one of the challenges in composing a cybersecurity program. Really, what's emerged over the last couple of years are cybersecurity advisors. I'll group them in sort of their own category, if you will. Some of these firms have a technological stance, but not the firms that are looking to sell one predominant technological solution like endpoint protection or vulnerability scanning. But some are technological, some are compliance, like our law firm, some are legal. But these need to have a team of subject matter experts that can opine on cybersecurity on a technological level, an operational level, and a compliance and governance levels. Those are the advisors that can sort of fashion all of the pieces together and sort of drive the process and make sure you're not overspending and making sure you're proceeding reasonably and efficiently and meeting all the standards of the rules. So I think more of those type of advisors that are focused on what the rule says and not just providing you IT or providing you compliance services or trying to sell a particular solution, that will be the starting point. That's where you'll get the most advice. That's where you'll cover enough ground and not overspend or do anything that's duplicative with other service providers.
That was some great detail, John. Thank you. Dan, back to you. I guess, the managers that are trying to raise capital, how do you see this as a major differentiator? I mean, the data stuff I think is always kind of interesting when you've harnessed all your data and it's in a place where you can actually use it. I always think that that's a huge value add, but how do you see some of this other stuff as being a differentiator for funds?
Well, first of all, I think without Kumar's product, I don't know how anyone can manage all their data in a single place. I think that you talk to all these data people, and they got 20 different systems and 20 different files, and nobody knows what's in anyway. So maybe AI Kumar can teach us all to use it. But look, I think at the end of the day, I think John brings up an extremely important point that in order to comply to this rule, you need to have the right people in place, and you need to be able to demonstrate to your investors, to your potential investors, that you take this stuff seriously. And I think that you can't just say, "Well, I'm using, this administrator or that technology firm or whatever to have them to provide these services." I think you need to really demonstrate that you are paying attention to these rules, regardless of how big your AUM is, because you want to show them that you take this subject extremely seriously. And I think that oftentimes in this industry, people don't they sort of pretend to take things seriously, and then they find out, like I think Kumar said earlier, is that the data is all in Excel spreadsheets or something like that, and that just doesn't that doesn't work anymore. And I think that this is an example of bringing on the right people who can do the right job to make sure you're in compliance, but most importantly, so that you can communicate the right message to both existing and future investors. And I think that's really what's important. And I think a lot of times what we're seeing is, that people do these things on the cheap. They buy the bill of goods that's being sold to them without really doing the research, and it comes back to bite them. So I think that's where we got to be thinking about it right now.
As a marketer, I appreciate that, and I agree with you. When people just write copy, right? It's just a bunch of nouns. This is a verb, right? This is so. John, how do you see AI facilitating managers to help them meet some of these standards? Kumar touched on a little bit of it earlier, but if I'd love to hear it from your perspective.
Yeah, interesting that you would ask the boring lawyer this question, because this is probably the most exciting part about AI, is the connective tissue it has with cybersecurity. So I think for what we do, AI is still sort of nascent and is posing its own regulatory risk to cyber, and my firm focuses a lot on that. However, to answer your question, so I think probably the most obvious, or the one that's playing out, as Kumar talked about, is sort of crystallizing and streamlining this data governance and data mapping exercises, and being able to create a lot of efficiency of identifying where your crown jewel data pools reside and trying to bring them together. We're already seeing a lot of capability where AI can really empower a fund manager to do that quickly and efficiently. So that's getting a lot of attention, and is pretty exciting. There are a lot of other use cases for it, for employee training, for example. A lot of cybersecurity entails laborious monitoring of numerous events and log files, and can generate false positives. AI has the capability to sort of streamline this, quiet the noise, and sort of make sure that any employee or human only actually gets the data points that are important and are material. That will save a lot of sort of heavy lifting. Same with detection. And then a novel use that I think has been one that is sort of gone under the radar in the cybersecurity community is insider threats. And whether it's a malicious or negligent insider, that threat is a little bit different than from someone outside the perimeter from trying to get in. And I think being able to map AI to some of the technology of your infrastructure can really identify some heuristic and behavioral things ahead of time. And I think AI will lend itself to that quite nicely.
Look, I mean, what I find fascinating is that these rules, as Kumar laid out, force you to get your data hygiene kind of sorted, and you have a baseline to do amazing things for scale and productivity. So you're almost getting a twofer, in my opinion, right? You're paying for it anyway, and the government's going to kind of say that you have to do it. So why not think about other ways to kind of scale and productivity? I think on our last podcast, we had Bill Salas said it kind of very succinctly. Before you can take on more AUM, you have that kind of trying to get capital and then trying to get staff, right? And so, I've heard Kumar talk about that. People are saying AI is going to reduce jobs, but what's interesting is it becomes a multiplier for scale, right? Because each, bot or agent or whatever kind of workflow you use is actually giving you more capacity for on the human side of things. So just my musings. So I guess John and Kumar, I don't know if you each want to, we went over a bunch of different points, but I don't know if you want to kind of recap by kind of talking about various, some of the readiness stuff. If you have any other kind of checklists or kind of, we're trying to help people get a guide. You went through a few things just in the last question, John, or two questions ago, but is there anything else you guys would like to add around kind of the kind of cyber readiness? Any closing remarks?
Sure. So I'll take first stab at it, Kumar, if that's okay. I think there's a lot of material to the rule. So if anyone's trying to get ahead of it, this would be the time to sort of write something down as sort of a cheat sheet. When you think of the new rule, there are really four pieces of it. The first piece is policies, procedures, and assessments. The second piece is this reporting requirement. The third piece is a disclosure requirement. And the fourth piece is a record keeping requirement. With that said, I think this really lends itself to sort of a four-step action plan on how to do this methodically. And I think from doing that, the four steps are to assess, and that would be a cybersecurity assessment. That will really give you the baseline. So it's assess, then plan, and that would include a budget, then implement and remediate as the third step. And the fourth step is just to test and evaluate. So assess, plan, implement/remediate, and test and evaluate. Those are the sort of the four ways to go about doing this.
Kumar, why don't you kind of pick it up from your perspective?
Yeah, and I think what John said is all absolutely to the point. A couple of things I just want to add is another thing which I've seen in the industry is education is all very important about this, especially when you talk about the cybersecurity and data and AI, all these things. It's kind of new to the people in the industry, but now because of this law, you have to know. So before you go and start talking to the advisors and all those things, you have to learn at least some basics. So when you're talking to the people, you understand exactly what the conversation is about and what the solution you are actually intend to buy and how you're going to solve it. So that is one part of that whole conversation where you start like, okay, to learn more about this. And the second is once you start learning and then you go through the process, step by step, the whole full process. You, in that process, you actually get some byproducts. So it's not just that okay, you follow these rules and then you apply this rule, and one thing is, of course, you are now compliant with the SEC, but also the other thing is this rule will by default get you a more like a data first company, which will be eventually you can evolve yourself as an AI first company. And where the entire world is moving towards, every company is getting to AI first company where the productivity and everything goes sky rocket. So that's the more, I would say, how I would like to end my conversation, that this is not just this SEC rule, but it also gives you a huge advantage to transform your company.
Great. Dan, did you have any closing remarks?
Well, I'm sure I could think of something pithy to say, but
Did you say pissy or pithy? I'm
I,
hoping
I can do
pithy.
both. No, I mean, look, I think this is one of those things where and John, I think we talked about this during our prep call for this program. Look, this is something that's top of mind for the three of us and Judith, right? The four of us and some other folks. It's not top of mind for a lot of people. And the fact that it's not top of mind is pretty scary, right? Because this SEC has run amok with regulation. We've got the worst chairman in the history of since Joe Kennedy, frankly. And as a result of that, I mean, this is dangerous stuff that needs to be taken care of, and it's going to be. It's a shame that more people aren't talking about it. So, Judith, thank you for putting this together, because I think that there's a lot of, you can't miss this. That's the only answer, right? I mean, you just can't miss it. So, yeah.
Just in fairness, I just want to say that the inspiration actually came from Kumar and Skylar meeting John, him laying things out, and all of us getting really kind of excited to kind of put some thought leadership together. So, in fairness,
Judith, there's years of therapy in there for you not to give me that compliment. That's all I can say. All right. So anyway.
Thank you, everyone. Great conversation. Obviously, we'll put everyone's contact details in the chat, but great conversation. Thank you, gentlemen.